Hello, and welcome to Exterior Wood Performance Considerations. My name is Chris Buffalo, and I'll be your host for this webinar. The significance of exposure, species, finish, and maintenance in exterior wood specification has to do with the natural wood look and preserving the natural wood look. So we're not covering paints and opaque finishes today. We're talking about see-through finishes that preserve the natural wood look. We are a registered provider with the AIA, and we offer an HSW CES credit for members. Non-member certificates of completion are available upon request. And as always, the AIA does not endorse any method, practice, or product that we cover in this class today. Our course is copyrighted by Buffalo Lumber, and you have 1 year from accreditation to get your MCE information squared away. So I want you to understand the importance of the exposure, especially with lot orientation, and a drainage plan for both the outside and the behind the siding. We want you to understand the species performance and how it's changed since sustainable forestry has come into play, and some of the performance reputations gained in the 60s are no longer applicable, so we want to go right at that. We want to understand some appearance challenges that we've had kind of shock some people in the design world, and it's one of those things that doesn't really get considered up front. So we want to cover basically everything that's ever bothered or shocked somebody. And then we want you to understand finish systems and maintenance schedules associated with those finish systems for exterior wood use, because the finish, the type of finish that you're going to use, and will dictate the maintenance budget that you have. And so you need some principles to kind of guide you through the vernacular that's going on to make sure that you make educated decisions and set yourself up for success and not a nightmare. Now, this house exemplifies some of the areas that we see where design itself can actually challenge the wood. We see a lot of desire for flat roof lines, okay? And these present drainage challenges. I don't know how far I'd get if I asked you guys to install a rain gutter up there, but I can probably hear a collective groan, okay? Which is fine. I mean, it's all part of the deal. We see a lot of desired large wood expanses, okay? So this course is going to kind of go right at the way the design itself can challenge the wood and kind of help you, give you some guiding posts to kind of mitigate that a little bit. The first part of our course is going to be appearance challenges, and the number one thing that affects the appearance of wood is the grade of wood. So if you want knotty woods, the important takeaway is that there's no limit to the number of knots. There's only a limit to the size and the type of knot. And if you want clear grades, there is a limit to the number of knots, but the takeaway with clears is typically if a knotty wood costs $5 a square foot, a clear wood is going to cost $10 a square foot. So regardless of where the price points fall, clears are typically twice as expensive as knots. And when you allow tight knots, you're not limiting the number of knots until you specify clear. So the big takeaway is if you like knots, it's going to be half as much for your wood. Having said that, and due to the fact that well over 98% of the architects that I've consulted with want clear, we're going to focus mainly on clear. Now, one of the things about clear grades that has surprised some people is the actual contrast. This darkest stick is a lot darker than the lightest stick, okay? Now, these pictures were actually sent to us by an architect, Homer. This is his wood, and he wasn't real happy with this contrast. You can see it occurs in the same stick, because his desire was for uniformity, okay? So this contrast was a little off-putting to him. We see a lot of this in the design community where the overall desired effect is uniformity. And what we see is that this was installed by a real old-timer, knew what he was doing. And he took the time ahead of time to sort for dark and light while it was laying on the ground, and he blended his darks and lights together. What you don't see is him putting a dark board in the middle of two light boards. And what you don't see is a lighter board, even if it's dark. So what he did was match shades on all these runs to create an overall effect of uniformity. In contrast, pun intended, this installer grabbed this wood as it came off the pile with no worrying about matching up, okay? And when you install it in this fashion, it can create a staccato kind of a checkerboard look. And this is what has shocked people. We've actually had, an architect's customer like, I don't want this. Hey, the problem is if you don't plan for it and you get to this stage, there's very little you can do to bring it more uniform except use a paint or a more opaque finish. So it's important, the takeaway from this slide is definitely that 98% of the final effect of uniformity is going to fall to the installer, pre-sorting for shade and then matching shades up as he puts it up on the wall. Now, there are some mills that will pull the darkest sticks out for you, but that's not really going to matter because you're still going to have some variation. The most impactful thing for uniformity is the installer pre-sorting and making sure he knows what he's doing and how to do it. Another challenge that contrast causes is stain selection. Okay, so here you can actually see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 different shades of brown on this one stain color. So what you don't want to have happen is you get send a sample that's this color and you prove it and you get 80% of your wood is this color. People are not going to like that. Okay, so you're going to want to ask when you're on your final color decision, you're going to want to get what I call a gradient range. So you're going to want to have from the darkest to the lightest of every board so you can make accurate color decisions. Okay. Now, this is not a hard, fast rule, but as a rule of thumb, you're going to see about 80% of the wood be a lighter and 20% going to be dark to darkest. Okay. So it's an 80-20 rule. If the installer pre-sorts, typically you can get 1 to 2 major visibility walls that are almost perfectly uniform, and then maybe have a couple walls that are a little bit more staccato because you saved your darks and put them back there. So there's a few ways to achieve uniformity and to maximize the way it looks, and we covered that a little bit I covered it in the stain webinar, so I'll be talking about that later. So another appearance challenge that we have today is the ever shrinking standard. My grandfather would roll over in his grave if he saw what they called a 2x4 today. It used to be a 2x4 meant you got an actual 2 by an actual 4. But then some bean counter came along and said, I think we start with a 2x4 and then we account for the thickness of the saw blade and we end up with 1.5 by 3.5. But now it's 1 3/8 by 3 3/8. So it's continuously shrinking. So either the saw blades are getting fatter and fatter or something else is up. Now, something else is up, okay? What's happening is we see sustainable forestry entering the marketplace, which means the introduction of younger trees, which means that mills have to maximize their yield, all right? So that's where we started seeing nominal 2x4, actual 1 3/4 by, 3 3/4, all right? So that's where nominal versus actual became part of the deal. When we say a nominal 1x8 bevel, we used to calculate it at 8 inches. It would actually be 7 3/8 inches wide, okay? And so we calculate coverage to overlap an inch at 6 3/8 inches. When we got this picture from one of our customers, clearly shy of 7 inches, this is like 6 7/8. So that's a half an inch, or almost 3/8 of an inch, gone right there, boom. So we call the mill and say, what's going on with this? We didn't factor the exposure correctly. What's going on? He's like, well, you better start factoring it at 7. Because the main bevel product we're going to carry now is going to be a 7. So it shrunk. They're still calling it 1x8, but it's not even 7 now. Okay. That may not be as big a deal in a bevel pattern, but let me tell you a little story where it did become a big deal. We had an architect come to us with a pattern. This is not his pattern. This is just an example. But he had a sight line in there. He had a shadow line. So this is your shadow line, the detail that he wanted. But what he did was he measured up all these shadow lines to line up with trim details that he calculated down to, the millimeter. I mean, there wasn't tolerance. So he sent us a diagram, say, hey, can you mill this? Now we took a look at it and sent it to our mill, and both of us said, yeah, we can totally mill it. Because when we looked at it, this number here, which now says 5 3/8, was 5.5. Okay. 6 months later, architect comes back to us and says, hey, all right, it's time to mill it. Let's go. Fires it to us. We take another look at it. By this time, the cant has changed from what we're starting with has changed from 5.5 to 5 3/8. Right? We lost 1/8 of an inch over that 6 months. The problem was the architect had all the sight lines designed at 1/8 of an inch different. So long story short, we tried to redesign that pattern every way that we could, and there was no way to get his sight lines to line up. We had to mill it out of an 8-inch. Okay, we had to mill 7/8 inch sawdust on every single board, and it costs over $40,000. It costs $40,000 more than the original estimate because we missed 1/8 of an inch change. We didn't know about this. Okay, so on our end of things, what I have done is we've created pattern diagrams with A, B, C, D, E on all these because of the ever-changing mill standard. What I tell architects is if you're making a design, okay, first of all, don't design all your sight lines to line up with anything in wood because wood's going to change sizes. And if you do it a year from now, you might not be able to make it, okay? So number one, that's a good thing. Don't tie in all your trim to where these sight lines are if you can avoid it. The other part is if you are that tight, you have to make sure the manufacturer you're going to use and what these dimensions exactly are, because when you're that tight, this 1/8 of an inch did cost $40,000. And so that's why we put the shrinking standard into this webinar. Another thing that we've seen as challenging is the face nailing. So, I've done a lot of architect consultations, and this here is a profile or a design that the people like. They like this shadow line. It's called nickel gap, penny gap, shadow profile. There's a lot of names for it, but it's this detail of having this trim line showing on the siding. When it first came out, we make this with a shiplap. Now, every time I have an architect call me and say, I want a shiplap with a nickel profile or shadow profile, I always tell them, you got to face nail that. Because I know that I get a collective gasp every time I say face nail. I don't want face nail. And that's almost a universal response from the design architectural community. They don't want face nails, okay? So I hear that every single consult. And I always make sure people know that if you specify a shiplap, it's going to be a face nail application. Now, to me as the expert, I always tell people it's not as big a concern as you think it is. This is actually the same house back. I always use the over 40 back 10 feet rule. If you're over 40 and you stand back 10 feet, you can't really see the nail. So in my professional opinion, it's not as big a concern as sometimes it's made out to be. This would be a consideration if it's going to be considerably more expensive to hide the nail than it would to do a face nail, okay? So then you start weighing how much does it really matter to me, all right? Now, having said that, well over 90% of the design architectural community still wants to hide the nail. As of this webinar, the best way to hide a nail with the shadow profile is a tongue and groove milled with this. Now, this is an 1/8 inch, but we can actually mill this all the way up to 3/8 of an inch. And with a 6 inch or narrower, you can use this application to hide the nail. Okay, so this is the best way to hide a nail. On an 8 inch, you can't do it with an 8 inch. If you go 8 inch, you have to put at least one of the nails through the face as by the book. But on a 6 inch and narrower, you can get away with a blind nail. Okay. Now, if you mill this gap to be 3/8 of an inch and you put a blind nail in there, if you got real close, you could probably see the nail, but it's not going to be visible from the back. So there are some hidden install systems out there, clip systems, but I have not been able to look at them close enough to say recommend them in webinars or in my product line. So currently, as of this webinar, the best way to do a hidden nail is to specify a tongue and groove milled with a gap that can be either 1/8 to 3/8 inches wide. Okay, so now I want to talk about species performance reputations, and mainly we're keying on redwood. We get a lot of architects specifying us for clear all heart redwood. And so I want to make sure that I clarify what they're expecting, okay? Redwood is the most sustainably harvested wood now, and the reason it's the most sustainably because it was our example of why you have to do sustainable harvesting. We almost extincted the species. It is now an endangered species. So redwood of today is way different than it was in the 60s and 70s because of the introduction of these younger trees into the marketplace. All right, so I go in depth on what these differences are. The main difference is performance. So this index finger is on old growth vertical grain redwood. This grain is so tight, you could not fit a razor blade in there. I mean, this is what gave redwood its awesome performance reputation that, durability, resistance to rot and decay is excellent in this board. This is probably from a 1,000-year-old tree. Okay. To the right of this is a much younger tree. You can see an inch or maybe more between grain rings. Now, the grain rings and the number of grain rings are what give a board its stability and its protection. Okay. In between these grain rings, this pulpy part will absorb and expel water. So you're going to see size changes of a greater degree laterally with this newer growth wood. Also, because there's way fewer grain rings, the decay, the resistance to decay and moisture is downgraded from excellent to moderate. So it's important to understand the performance difference between this and this is going to be pretty good. Downgraded from excellent to moderate is a huge difference. The other difference we see is in the appearance. Now here we see a lot of contrast, but this contrast is not caused by sap or iron content in the soil. This contrast is caused only by the age of the tree. This is old growth and this is third growth. So this becomes important because visually is more important to architects. This was actually, I put this in the webinar because early in my career, we had an architect specify us for clear all heart redwood based on thinking it was all going to look like this. When he got the order, he refused it. And because he refused it, the builder that ordered it lost his business. The lumberyard that ordered it from us had to spend thousands of dollars, and we had to spend thousands of dollars to correct this issue. And the entirety of the issue became the architect's visual expectation. And so now, every time I have an architect come to us and say, I want clear halt redwood, we take them to this section on our website and say, look at this differences, look at the downgrade, look at why you're specifying redwood, because that becomes important, where the value is. Now, the difference between old growth and second and third growth is substantial. And every time I say that, architects will say, well, can you still get the old stuff? And the answer is yeah. I mean, there's some old timers that are sitting on it. There's some guys that have a little bit of old growth sparse throughout their inventory. And you can get it from reclaimed timbers and stuff. So there's ways to get the old growth. But it becomes a matter of value proposition, okay? If you're talking about wood siding and you're specifying redwood for a performance reputation, it's no longer there. It's not going to perform as good as it used to because you're just putting in too much old growth or young growth into the equation. If you say, I want all old growth, then you're talking about either a guy that's sitting on it like it's gold or a guy that's got to go through 40,000 feet of inventory to pull out 5,000 feet of old growth. Either way, your costs are going to go way up. And so when costs get that high, you've got to determine where your value lies. And in my professional opinion, redwood has transitioned from being valuable because it's so awesome to being valuable because it's so rare. And we're not going to have it that much longer, okay? So if you say to me, hey, Chris, I want to specify redwood because it's rare and we want a historic value, we want to do this reclamation project and we hear the story behind it, totally valuable. If you're going to specify because you want the best performing wood siding product, not a viable spec anymore. Have to use cedar for that. So I saw this hideous movie where they're eating endangered species for dinner. I cannot imagine it tasted all that well. So unless you value the rarity, then it's cost prohibitive. In my estimation, I love redwood. I would do it. If you see this presentation and you love redwood, this probably won't throw you off of redwood. However, if you see this and you're like, oh, I don't like that, then you got to move over to cedar, okay? Because the value of redwood today is in the fact that it's rare. Now we bring cedar on the other hand. In cedar, we see color differentiation, but this is not caused by the age of the tree. Okay, when we zoom in on the same wall a little closer, we can see that even the lighter boards have the super tight grain rings. So in cedar, because there's more old growth trees available and we have adopted sustainable forestry practices, cedar is a much more valuable commodity spec. So if you say, I want clear cedar because it's the best performing wood, then that's the value that you're getting. Okay, so redwood value because it's rare. Cedar currently is the best performer. We're still able to get mostly old growth in the high-end clear grades. Now, as time goes by, you're going to see the introduction of younger trees even in the cedar. Currently, this is true. That's going to change. When it starts to change, we hopefully will be there to inform you. So we cover redwood and cedar in depth because those are the most realistic exterior wood specifications. Cypress has some natural resistance, but it doesn't have as much of an exposure where we are. You can get that in the southeast. And so I don't have a lot of information on cypress. Doug fir and sap redwood. Now, if you're a person that loves to wash your car and you take pride in the appearance and you're going to stay all over the maintenance and you just love it, you can use a Doug fir and a sap redwood. The difference between that and cedar is if you saw a spot on your wall with cedar and you say, you know what, I don't want to do that this year, I'm going to do it next year. The biggest risk you have is you're going to have a bigger spot of cedar on your wall next year. You can't really do that with a Doug fir or a sap redwood, because if you think you need to do it this year and you're right and you leave it for a year, you're going to have run the risk of cellular degradation and actual damage to the wood. So unless the wood carries a natural resistance to rot, you really have to be all over your maintenance. And this last one, just say no to pine. I mean, I know it's available in stores and stuff, but I am adamantly against the use of pine, because I'm the one talking to people who have used pine and had it fail. And now I got to tell them you got to use cedar. And they're really pulling their hair out because it cost them a certain amount of money to use pine, and then it failed. Now it costs them double the amount to use cedar, which is triple the amount they would have spent had they used cedar in the first place. So just say no to pine. Now add this slide in here, because every time I tell somebody just say no to pine, they say, well, we've been using pine around here for 100 years, blah, blah, blah. And that might be true, okay? 50 years ago, 30 years ago, you were able to use, this would be an indigenously grown New England pine tree. And again, we see super tight grain rings. This is probably 300-400-year-old tree. This board, you could prep it properly, wrap it with a finish, and put it up on the wall. That would work, no problem. But that's not what they're growing today. Today, they're growing this super fast growth pine. Look at this. There's no grain ring in there. There's no grain ring. These are like 2-3 inches, okay? You can't, this is a rot magnet, all right? This distance between these rings, that's gonna suck and expel water like a sponge. It's gonna magnetize rot to come towards you. It is a product designed to fail. That's why I hate it. I mean, I have actually literally talked to 20 or 30 people that have had it fail. I talked to one guy that had it fail. He went ahead and did it again himself to make sure he prepped it right, failed again, and then he came to us with cedar. So the pine they have on the market is not worth it. I don't care if it's available in every store. I will stand up and tell every store that's selling pine that they should totally not, because it's irresponsible to the customer. It's a product designed to fail. All right, off my soapbox about the pine, let's talk about exposure. When you're talking about exposure to the sun, you want to factor in winter and summer sun. And this house was a passive energy design, so they put this roof on here to block the summer sun but allow the winter sun in to warm it in the winter and cool it in the summer. My thing is, when you're talking about sun exposure, you're going to want to factor in the difference between winter and summer sun. The other consideration in exposure is controlling moisture. You know, wind-driven rain is a major threat. Anywhere water is going to contact your wood directly is going to pose a threat. And then in this video or this webinar, we're going to show you how water and the sun combine forces to pose a major threat to your wood and a challenge to wood care. Here we are at our design challenge house, okay? So your south-facing walls are going to get continuous sunlight, all right? And continuous sunlight plus all the rain is going to equal the south side needs a lot more maintenance. And I've got a guy that has to do the south side every year and the rest of his house only every 4, okay? When I talk about even distribution along flat roof lines, every time you have a flat area, it's going to cause a drainage challenge, because anywhere water concentrates on a wood finish, it's going to pose a challenge to the finish. Okay, when we talk about splashback, it's the same thing. Splashback is where water hits the ground and bounces up off your wood continuously and creates a wear on the finish. It can happen on the ground, and it can also happen on little shelves that you create right here. And so we're going to have to put a plan in for splashback, and we have to put a plan in for ground clearance. So when we're talking about even moisture distribution, when you got a flat roof line like this, you got to make sure you select the right flashing and that it's installed correctly. Something is wrong with this flashing, because you can see water dripping down here in concentrated amounts here as well. And what happens is when water drips in concentrated amounts, it wears the finish off and the sun jumps in to turn it black. The same with this little lamp detail. Because it doesn't have water directed out and over, it comes down and around, it concentrates the water on each side of this, challenging the finish and causing the wood to turn black. So as a general rule, we like to see flashing that allows water to come out and over the siding and not down onto it. And we want to make sure it's installed properly so you don't have concentrations in every area. You want to design coverages for your light fixtures that allow water to come out and over and not down and around and onto the wood siding. Okay, here on this same problem, this flashing directs the water right and left, where it comes focused down in this one channel next to the window trim, and it concentrates and poses a risk to the finish. Concentrated water carved the Grand Canyon. It's the most powerful force on the universe. So there's no way any finish that can be expected to stand up to concentrations of water. So it's highly important at the design stage to design flashings and things that allow and exposures, or excuse me, drainage systems that allow water to come out and over the wood and not down onto it everywhere possible. Now, this is an example of a log cabin sided home that didn't have rain gutters on it. And this is where we had a concentrated water drainage issue, and it really washed the finish off the wall, and the sun came in and turned it black. Same here, this trim piece sticks out past this overhang, and this water splashback issue, all of those areas, the finish was worn off by continuous water exposure, and then the sun came in and turned everything black. Here we see the same issue. The water was caused by splashing back from this tank, and it wore the finish down, turned the wood black. And we talked about concentrated water in your drainage plan. It also has the same effect in splashback. This is actually a roof covering, and the water bouncing continuously off the ground and up onto this bottom rung here, not only is it causing the finish to wear off, but it's literally causing that to rot. Same thing we see here on this little shelf, water coming in and bouncing off and hitting these areas right here continuously, created a wear on the finish, and the sun came in and turned the wood black. Now, in order to protect against splashback, we like to see 18 inches here where water can come down and bounce up against something other than the wood. I like stone accents. Stone accents is what I recommend. Same here. We like to see a stone accent on the very bottom part so you don't put the pressure on that wood. Now, there's some other substrates that would be, you can creatively find out. Just find out if it can take continuous water pounding, because wood can't. You don't want to put your wood all the way to the ground if at all possible. Here we see the double whammy of the lawn coming all the way up to the wood and the wood coming all the way down to the lawn. This is not a finish failure where the sun is turned black. This is a mildew party. Wherever lawn meets wood, party time. And the party continues on up the wall. This is going to turn black within 6 months if they don't do something about it. So here we have the triple whammy. So you have the splashback issue of continuous pounding. It's also hitting a mildew party and then splashing back up to both wear down the finish and bring the mildew party to the wood. So because of these combined issues, we like to see 18 inches before the first foliage, and we like to see at least 18 inches up here. This one was 12. 12 will protect them pretty good because it's going to take most of it, and it's not going to be bringing a mildew party up to it. It's going to hit nice gravel. So this is the perfect scenario for protecting against splashback and giving yourself ground clearance. Now, I love this design because it incorporates a lot of the things that we see of the desires of the design community, these large wood expanses, the flat roof lines, but this place incorporated drainage. These roof caps will bring the water out and over the siding and not down onto it as a general rule. I mean, if the wind's blowing and it blows a little bit of water on it, that's fine, but you want to design for the water to come out and over the siding and straight down to the ground whenever possible. Here they did the same thing with the roof. That flashing will bring it out and over. And I like this little inset design here too, because that means this design will bring the water out and over this lower piece, okay? And all the way down to the ground, they've got drainage figured out. Now, this is 30 years with no finish. This is a house that had that silver patina that everybody wants. And I would say the way he got there with no real dark spots is the architects really planned a good drainage into this design, and I just love this design. All right, so that covers drainage on the outside of the wall. What about behind the siding? Because wood is, the biggest risk to wood is rot, and the biggest way to get rot is to have the wood up against the sheathing. And the reason people make this mistake is they're not aware that no matter what you do, you can't stop holes. There are going to be holes in your sheathing. Okay, what you need to do is create a gap between the siding and the sheeting. And the reason that becomes so important is because if you put the siding directly up against the stud wall, you run the risk of condensating moisture and moisture getting in there. You cannot create a perfect barrier. We actually had a guy trying to seal out all water. He was going around his house caulking up all the joints and windows and everything, and it was making the problem worse because you literally cannot stop water from getting behind there. It comes there from the inside through condensation. So if you're going trying to seal all the water out, all you're doing is locking it in and exacerbating the problem. Okay. So, and the problem, if moisture enters into that cavity and cannot escape, it will cause problems. And the problem with rot is it doesn't always manifest itself to the face of the siding before it ruins your wall. In this case, the rot actually went backwards into the sheeting and the stud wall before it showed signs on the face. So by the time they realized this, they had to completely replace the entire wall. This also was pine, by the way. One of the finishes that got me on my pine soapbox was this project right here. So water management is important from top to bottom. Obviously overhangs are going to keep wind-driven rain down there. But we see a lot of design desires that, they don't want to see an overhang. It's contrary to the overall, design that they're looking for. And when that's the case, drainage paths to the outside should water get in become crucially important. And allowing enough room for air to flow in after the water leaves is crucially important to dry those components. And because you're allowing air and water to constantly hit those components, you need to select components that are durable enough to stand up to constant pressure. Okay? When you're talking about wood siding especially, it's very important you don't want to take the cheapest product. You want to take the product that is proven to work the best with wood. When you create an air gap, you're allowing air and water to flow behind here, and you're protecting against wind-driven rain, and you're reducing hydrostatic pressure, which means that water will go where you want it to go. Now, there are three main ways you can create a gap between the stud wall and the siding. First way is this is a furring strip attached over the stud walls, and then we attach the siding over the furring strips. This creates a 3/4 of an inch gap between the stud wall and the siding, and allows air and water to flow. Put a little insect screen down here, and you have a nice area for air and water to flow. Okay. Now, sometimes the trim tolerance doesn't allow for 3/4 of an inch thickness of the furring strip, and at that point you want to use a mesh wrap, and this is also called rain screen. And the mesh wrap gives you the same water and air can flow, but it will compress to 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch, which allows you to use a thinner trim. And this becomes important, especially on a vertical installation, where a lot of times on a vertical install, they don't realize they have to use furring strips until all of the trim is installed. And at that point, you're going to look at a 5-digit fix to get the trim to come out the thickness of the furring strips. Otherwise, when you install your siding will be proud of the trim and it'll look ridiculous. So you either have to fur out all the trim, tear all the trim off, or cheat and stick the siding right to the sheet metal, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so when you find yourself in the pickle where you didn't account for the thickness of a furring strip, rain screen to the rescue, mesh wrap to the rescue. You can get it down to 1/4 of an inch. You can install your siding, and most of the time the siding is going to be proud of the trim. The trim is going to be proud of the siding, which is what you want. The third case over here is what we call a drain wrap. Now, drain is going to allow water to go down, but it does not allow enough room for air to circulate after the water leaves. So drain wrap is not going to allow for drying. You do not want to use a drain wrap in the East Coast or a heavy moisture climate. Drain wrap is better for an Arizona, Nevada climate where you don't have a lot of humidity in the air and you don't have a lot of rainfall. The wind-driven rain phenomena is pretty amazing, but yes, water will go uphill due to hydrostatic pressure. So when you create a gap, it reduces the pressure, which sucks water up behind your wood. And when water does get in there, it allows it a place to go. Water is like LeBron James. You cannot stop it. You can only hope to contain it. If water gets in your house, you're like, hey, water, how you doing? Right this way. There you go. You have it a place to go. You don't have to lose any sleep over it. Now, this one says reduces the potential for water damage. My feeling is that if you use wood and you seal all 6 sides and you put a gap, you are eliminating the risk of rot, therefore eliminating the greatest threat to any wood siding project. I'm not a big data guy, so I'm not going to read this slide to you. Basically, this says it's scientifically proven that gaps work, and they've done the test. We can make this slide available to you if you would like it for a specification. Just know that it's been proven gaps actually work, and that's the best possible way to install wood. Now, along with the gap, the number one best thing you can do is seal all 6 sides of your board before you put it up on the wall. The most important benefit of factory finishing is the ability to give you a back seal. All right, so the factory finish is great for getting a seal on all 6 sides. The other thing is you don't want to just put it up on the wall and stain one face, because then you're putting an uneven drying force on the wood. It's going to make it want to cup. It's going to make it want to crack and peel. So you're going to want to seal all 6 sides of every board in order to protect your wood. The best part is the back seal protects it from rot, and then the entirety of the seal protects it from uneven drying. Now, we talked about factory finishing. Here we show a diagram of a finish machine where we've got jets on the bottom, jets on the top, rollers on the bottom and the top, and rollers on the side. So as this board shoots through the machine, the biggest benefit is that it gives us a back seal. Okay, it does give you even pressure and it does give you a nice coating, but the biggest benefit of factory finish is giving the back seal at an affordable cost. All right. Now, the first question I get from almost every wood lover is, how much maintenance am I going to have to do? And I always tell them maintenance depends on 2 things: the opacity of the finish and your love of the wood. So, rule of thumb estimates, if you're using a transparent finish, figure every 1 to 2 years. If you're going to try to preserve the natural wood look and you're going to use a transparent, you're going to be out there every year or 2. There's no way around it, especially if you use smooth face. Semi-transparent, you can get 3 to 5 if you use rough face and keep an eye on it. When you start getting into semi-solid, you're starting to lose some of the natural wood aspects, but you're gaining longevity. So a semi-solid with a 1 to 2 coat, figure 5 to 8 years. By the time you get to a solid stain, you are basically talking about a paint. You're covering up most of the natural wood aspects, but you're gaining 8 to 10 years. By the time you get to a 2-coat solid stain, you might as well go with a latex paint. We put an oil-based bleed block and primer on and a latex paint at the factory, and then you install it and put another coat of paint on after the install. Typically, you're going to get a 25-year warranty out of that. Do not adjust the sound on your computer. I learned in Toastmasters that if I pause, it draws attention. And of anything else in this presentation, I want to draw your attention, and I beg of all my design community, at least consider the rough texture. And the reason I say this is because every time I say this to an architect or a designer, I get a gasp. No way, we want to use the smooth face, okay? I'm going to go into why I think rough texture is at least worth considering, and I'm going to hit it so hard in a stain webinar you get sick of me, but it's what you need to know. All right, so we go with rough and smooth. This is smooth, this is rough. Now, it's my contention, again with the over 40 back 10 feet rule, you can't really tell the difference between rough and smooth, but your wallet will be able to tell the difference. If you have to do this wall 5 times in 10 years, and you have to do this wall 2 times in 10 years, if we factor in the cost at ballpark $15 a square foot, let's say over 1,000 square foot, for every year you don't have to finish it, you saved yourself $15,000, okay? And the maintenance needs to refinish the smooth face, especially if you use a film forming finish, are way more expensive than the rough. Often on the smooth face, you need to use a stripper and sand it. On the rough, most of the time you need to clean it up. You will never have to sand the rough face. So if we're talking a 10-year span and we're talking $15 a square foot per 1,000 square feet, this one at 5 times in 2 years, this one at 5 times in 10 years, this one at 2 times in 10 years. This one's 30 grand. This one's, sorry, I'm not doing the math correctly. This one, twice in 5 years, you're looking at 30 grand. This one, 5 times in 10 years, you're looking at 75. So there's a big difference in cost over 10 years between rough and smooth. And so what you have to at the design level is Is the difference in appearance really worth it? I mean, your customer, it doubles the life of their stain, and so therefore it cuts the maintenance budget in half, if not more than half, because it also cuts your hassle factor out. So at least consider the rough face. Oh, I thought I was off my bandwagon there, but I'm not quite. The last and most important benefit of rough face is the way that the stain explodes off of it. As you do a smooth face, each time you do a coat of stain, it kind of darkens and dulls it a little bit. Whereas on the rough face, because it soaks up so much stain, the color just explodes back off the boards. So when you're a wood lover and you're buying wood, you love it every time you drive up your driveway. It gives you a heartwarming feeling. When somebody walks down the street and says, "Oh, I love your wood," it gives you a pride of ownership, okay? And these things are all really rejuvenated when you refinish a rough face. So not only are you happy that the house looks like it did when it was brand new, you're also clicking your heels that you only have to maintain it half as much as the people who use the smooth face across the street do. Now, this is an example of a multi-million-dollar mansion that the architects did want her to use smooth face on there. But, she breeds horses for horse racing, and she has all kinds of parties out there. And I said, you know what? If you do smooth face and you're out there every year, every 2 years maintaining it, it's going to get in the way of what you have this house for. But if we do rough face, then you're going to get a good 3, 4, maybe even 5 years out of this. So for you, it isn't the budgetary concern, it's the hassle factor in blocking off your yard and getting in the way of your party's concern. So this multi-million-dollar customer opted to do rough face for the frequency issue. All right, so we're going to talk about finish and maintenance, all right, oil versus water. And when I did the original live version of the webinar, this is the section that the architects asked me to expand on. And so when I went to do it for the recorded version, it turned into a webinar of its own. So if you feel this is shameless or not, I don't care. There was too much vital information to try to cram into this webinar. I believe that the stain webinar is packed with so much information about what has been going on since the 2012 law change that it is must see for you. I do have an HSW credit for it and you get your CES credits for it, but if you're seriously going to use wood, you absolutely need to look at that stain webinar. Because I didn't even realize this stuff until it started fleshing out during the process of that, all right? So I'm going to cover the basics here and then recommend highly that you see the stain webinar, because if you do this basics webinar and the stain webinar, you are going to be fully equipped to specify wood or decide not to specify wood. Either way is fine with me. All right. Oil penetrates the wood. Since the dawn of wood care, we have known that oil penetrates conditions and takes care of wood. Oil requires minimal prep and minimal cleanup because it penetrates so well. It leaves itself off of the surface, so you do not have to use wood strippers to clean it up. It has a, 2,000 year proven track record. I don't know how long they've been oiling wood, but it's, thousands of years. And water doesn't have that kind of a track record. Water-based finishes form films. They perform differently than oil-based penetrating finishes. I never have liked them at all unless you get into the paint arena, but when you're talking about stains, I want penetration. Water-based and born stains require complete removal of the existing stain in order to refinish, which brings in the use of strippers. And when you bring in the need for caustic strippers, you just doubled your labor, doubled your hassle factor. You have to manage hazardous materials. It becomes a very major concern, and therefore it becomes a major consideration at the spec level. Okay, it does not have as proven of a track record. All right, so we're going to talk about this next slide, and I'm going to tell you about a problem that we had, and I'm going to cover a question you have to ask your tech departments, but I didn't expand this section because I turned it into a whole stain webinar. So I'm going to cover the basics on this next slide. So this is actually a film forming finish success story. This guy had clear cedar. We were able to sand it, put this finish on there. This is at the 4-year mark, and you can see he doesn't have any darkening. This stain held up very well, and he got a 4-year lifespan out of it. So it performed very, very well. The problem came when it came time to refinish, and we contacted the tech department, and they said this was a film forming stain. and he's going to have to use strippers to get it off of there. So when he heard that and he found out, how hazardous the material the stripper really is, he was upset. He didn't want that stripper around his foliage. He didn't want it around his pets. He didn't want it around his family. Okay. He did not like the fact that a film forming finish that is coming onto the market made him use a hazardous material. Okay. So he actually switched up the process, went ahead and paid the extra money to have them sand this whole house back down so that he could switch to an oil-based penetrating stain. Now, I'll pause here to tell you that in 2012, they passed a law that limits the number of chemicals that you can put in a stain, thereby limiting the amount of oil you can actually put in a stain. And when that happened, the manufacturers went to the drawing board and started scrambling, trying to figure out how to get their stain back on the market in compliance with this law. And that caused a ton of film forming finishes to enter the marketplace. And it caused a ton of people that had been using the same stain for years to not realize there had been a change, incorrectly apply their stain. And so the number of failures since 2012 has grown tremendously. So the takeaway on this level is find a penetrating oil-based stain, or find a penetrating stain where there's new technology. Now, some stains will say they penetrate, some say they don't. They're going to give you all kinds of vernacular and gibberish. You can cut through all of that with one simple question, the most important question, the takeaway from the oil versus water debate, the takeaway from film forming versus penetrating stain is this. Call the tech department of any company who you are planning on using that stain and ask them for this specific stain. Does this stain penetrate enough that I do not have to use a stripper to remove every particle of the stain before I refinish? Or is it a film forming and requires the use of strippers to refinish? Because if it requires the use of strippers to refinish, you have doubled your hassle factor, created a need for hazardous material management, created a doubling of the labor involved, and created what could be a real pickle and a health and environment concern for your customer. So from this webinar, the takeaway is the stain I'm using penetrating? And if it is penetrating, does it penetrate enough where I don't have to use strippers? Because if you have to use a stripper, you're going to double your costs. I mean, there's just no other way to get around it. All right. I think I've pounded the smooth face, rough face, film forming enough. We're going to go into some creative designs. I see a lot of, well, not a lot, but I've seen a few diagonal. And that's not a problem if you're going to plan for concentrated water banging around at this point. So this is going to be a pressure point. This down here is going to be a pressure point. Anywhere you're directing water in concentrated amounts is going to create a pressure point. Now, I talked to this builder and he said, yeah, I knew that. So I put some flashing here that'll catch the water. It won't touch this piece of trim. It'll come smoking down here and go all the way down. Same with this flashing, comes all the way down. Same with this flashing, all the way down. So the water has a place to go on that. So that's the biggest thing, is pay attention if you're doing creative diagonal designs. Wherever you're going to concentrate water, you're going to create a pressure point wherever that water continuously hits. This design I threw in for two reasons. This was an architect homeowner, Clarence. He was one of the only 3 architects I've ever had use a knotty wood in his design. And I just love this metal tile roof. Some people this is one of those designs that you either love or hate. I happen to be the one that loves it. I like the rustic look mixed with the tile. I just thought this was so unique. I'd never seen anything like it. I like to throw it in here. And this was Clarence's own home. He was great to work with. I find that a lot of times the architects doing their own home are having some fun with it, and they're doing some things, and it's fun to consult with them. It can also be a huge pain in the butt because they are so detail oriented, but we love that because the more we learn, the more we share with architects, learning what they learn and learn what we're learning, the more that we can direct all and everyone to, being happy and successful with their wood project. So in conclusion, I want you to think about the orientation of the lot and plan for exposures. Try to keep the house oriented so that the south side of the wall has a lot of, trim and, elements that don't incorporate so much wood. I want you to think about drainage outside, get the water out and over the wood, not down onto it. And behind the siding, we want to create enough space so air and water can flow so the wood can drain and also dry. We want to consider natural variation of the wood a positive characteristic and plan for it. If the desired effect is uniformity, you're going to have to be in communication with whoever gets the bid and wins the install so that they know how to sort it ahead of time. So you might even write that into the spec, okay? Pre-sorting and matching up lights and darks so that you create uniformity. And then you're going to want to set your customers and yourself up for success by understanding the maintenance costs and the maintenance implications when you make these decisions on smooth versus rough, oil versus water, penetrating versus film forming. And I apologize, I couldn't expand on it enough here, but it turned into an entire webinar because there's so many things you absolutely need to know. I'm not afraid of shamelessly promoting the stain webinar because I'm not trying to promote wood use or me. I'm hitting you in the face with things that I have seen cause other people to fail so that we can lead as many people to success as is possible. All right, so I hope I've hit drainage and exposure well enough. The species performance is pretty important because we see a lot of people getting creative and, hey, let's use a Doug fir. And you really have to plan in extra maintenance if you're not going to use cedar. I mean, cedar really is the most realistic choice. We talked about appearance challenges. You're going to want to make sure you know your customers and you know what to expect. And the understanding of finish and maintenance systems, again, shameless plug for the stain webinar. So that concludes this portion or this webinar on the basics of wood. If you have questions, I want you to send all your questions to Suzanne@cedarsiding.org and I will get all of them answered. The other part of that is that I know architects, especially architects doing their own homes, are the best researchers. Now, I don't put anything into a webinar that I have not experienced firsthand, but I'm not the end-all be-all authority, and things change. If you discover systems that are working, products that are working, things that are working for you, please share them with us. We will incorporate them into our presentations and bring them out to the design community at large. My goal in life is to create a network of people who are currently using wood, talking about what they're experiencing, to the people who are thinking about using wood and talking about what they should be considering in the front so that you can set yourselves up and your customers up for a dream and not a nightmare. This is Chris Buffalo signing off. Thank you very, very much, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.